You think I've moved on? Watch closely." Peter Blackwood stood on stage, announcing his wedding date to the elite, a calculated smile masking everything. The room applauded, cameras flashed, but he didn't see her yet, the woman he thought he'd left behind. Then the doors opened. Bella entered, calm, radiant, and in her arms a newborn baby. The room froze. Peter's breath caught. That baby was his. What happens next will shatter everything he thought he controlled. Don't blink, because every secret, every choice, every heartbreak is about to explode before your eyes. Tell me, where are you listening from? Wherever you are, may this story bring a little light into your heart and peace to your soul. I pray for your happiness, for your strength, and for moments that make life beautiful. Stay with me until the very last chapter, because the ending will touch your soul in ways you never expected. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel to join our family of story lovers. Now let's dive into today's story. The Blackwood mansion glittered under the weight of its own opulence, crystal chandeliers scattering light across the polished marble floors, reflecting in the golden accents of the room. Peter Blackwood stood at the center. A man sculpted in control and confidence, his tailored suit pressed perfectly against his tall frame, his hand resting possessively on Julie's waist. The air smelled faintly of champagne and winter pine, but the warmth of the room could not mask the tension thrumming just beneath the surface. Cameras clicked with relentless precision, capturing every polished smile, every gesture designed to radiate power and satisfaction. Peter's eyes scanned the crowd with the cold calculation of a chess master, noting who would watch, who would gossip, who would envy. This moment had been rehearsed in his mind hundreds of times. Every line he would speak, every subtle inflection of his voice meant to convey mastery over not just the room, but over his past, over Bella herself. When he spoke, announcing the wedding date with a clarity that carried across the glittering hall, it was not merely information, it was a statement. Each word fell like a carefully aimed arrow, designed to pierce invisibly, to reach the ears of the one person who mattered most beyond the cameras and champagne. He imagined Bella somewhere in the room, perhaps a shadow at the edges, perhaps clutching herself against the cold, perhaps filled with quiet disbelief. He wanted her to see it. He wanted her to understand that the past had been temporary, that she had been a chapter he had closed flawlessly, and that his life had moved forward while hers had remained a memory in his rear view. Applause erupted as his voice concluded the announcement, glasses raised, cameras flashing with merciless attention, the hall echoing with polite admiration and unspoken envy. Yet even amidst the celebration, a tension lingered, almost imperceptible, as if the air itself had paused in expectation. Then the doors opened again, not with the casual elegance of entrance, but with a presence that swallowed the room whole. Silence crashed through the hall like a tidal wave. Every conversation died mid-sentence, glasses halted mid-air, and the chandeliers seemed to flicker as if acknowledging the weight of what had arrived. Bella stepped in slowly, deliberately, her winter black coat falling elegantly around her, a sharp contrast to the glittering warmth of the party. There was no drama in her movements, no pleading, no bitterness, only a calm radiance that demanded attention without demanding explanation. In her arms, swaddled with care, rested a newborn baby boy. The child's tiny fingers curled instinctively against her chest, his eyes closed momentarily, unaware of the storm his presence had just unleashed. Every guest felt the shift, the air thickened, the polite applause stilled into astonishment. The cameras wavered as operators fumbled to capture the impossible. Julie stiffened immediately, her grip tightening on Peter's arm. Her carefully constructed confidence faltered for the first time, just enough for anyone paying attention to notice. Her lips parted, forming a soundless gasp that spoke volumes in the silence. She had believed she was the pinnacle of his attention tonight, the embodiment of his moving-on performance, the proof of his claimed closure. And then Bella appeared, serene and untouchable, carrying the undeniable, living testament to a life Peter had left behind but could never erase. Peter himself felt his breath catch, an involuntary reaction that betrayed every ounce of his careful composure. The announcement, the ceremony, the applause, all became irrelevant in the face of this quiet, relentless truth. He recognized the child instantly, in the shape of his tiny nose, the curve of his lips, the depth in his eyes, a reflection of himself he had never been prepared to see. Every step Bella took toward the center of the room was measured, yet it carried the weight of inevitability. Peter's mind raced, struggling to comprehend the sequence of events that had led here. She had been gone. He had moved on, or so he thought. And now she returned, not as a ghost of memory, but as a living, breathing force, with a child that rendered every calculated move he had made meaningless. Murmurs began to ripple through the crowd, whispers rising and falling like the tide, carrying speculation, shock, and disbelief. Julie's eyes narrowed, searching for answers, for explanations, for a way to reclaim control of a situation that had never belonged to her. But Bella offered nothing beyond her presence, her stillness, her quiet command of the room. She did not speak, she did not cry. She simply existed, and in doing so, she rewrote the rules of engagement in a single, unyielding act. Peter's heart thumped against the ribcage with a tempo he had not felt in years, a mixture of panic, disbelief, and a reluctant surge of recognition that hit him harder than he cared to admit. His hand twitched, but he did not move it to the child, did not reach for Bella, did not attempt to reclaim control in the way he had been trained to do his entire life. The weight of realization settled in him slowly, grinding against the armor he had built over years of ambition, work, and emotional detachment. This child was not just a reminder. He was proof, irrefutable and immediate, that the past had consequences, that time had not erased mistakes, and that no amount of performance could alter the truth. Now, sitting in the center of the room, Bella's eyes lifted, meeting Peter's for the briefest instant, and it was enough to unspool his entire carefully maintained facade. There was no plea in her gaze, no longing, only a steady, unwavering acknowledgement that she was in control of the story now. A shiver ran through Peter, not from the cold of winter snow that had likely kissed her cheeks on the way in, but from the shock of seeing someone he had dismissed with such finality return to define the narrative once again. Every muscle in his body tensed, every thought fractured, every sense sharpened. The crowd remained frozen, some sensing the electricity, some too polite to react, and some oblivious, clapping awkwardly at their own discomfort. The baby shifted against Bella's chest, eyes fluttering open. They were blue at first glance, luminous and questioning, and Peter's heart lurched violently. That tiny gaze, so innocent and yet so familiar, anchored the chaos of the moment to an undeniable reality. The room seemed to shrink, the chandeliers dimmed in his perception, and the applause faded entirely from his consciousness. The child's presence was a silent accusation, a wordless statement of what Peter had failed to notice, what he had neglected, what he had believed he could outrun. He swallowed hard, the taste of cold metal on his tongue, knowing that nothing, no wealth, no image, no calculated announcement could erase this confrontation with his own past. Guests began shifting uncomfortably, sensing the unspoken tension thickening the air. Some whispered to neighbors, speculating quietly about paternity, scandal, and the implications for the Blackwood Empire. Others simply stared, too stunned to speak, caught between curiosity and etiquette. Julie's hand gripped his arm so tightly that it left a faint mark, but Peter barely registered it. His eyes never left Bella and the child, analyzing every movement, memorizing the subtle rise and fall of the baby's chest, the tilt of Bella's chin, the calm fire in her eyes. It was a tableau of quiet dominance, of power reclaimed without a word, and Peter felt the first true pang of fear in years. And then, as if the room itself waited for a signal, Bella stopped midway toward the center, the baby shifting in her arms with a tiny yawn that seemed to punctuate the moment. Her gaze flicked across Peter's face again, a whisper of recognition, and he realized with chilling certainty that nothing he had built tonight, no declaration, no engagement, no performance, could undo what she carried in her arms. The doors closed softly behind her, a final seal on the inevitability of what had arrived. Peter's hand twitched again, his composure cracking, a question forming silently in his mind. How did she get here? How did this happen under my control? He knew he had to respond, yet every instinct screamed that moving first could ruin everything, and that for the first time he had no plan. The hall held its breath. Julie's lips pressed thin, her eyes darting between Peter and Bella, and the cameras hesitated, capturing the tension that no flash could fully illuminate. Peter's chest tightened, every thought scattering like glass shards in the wind. Bella's presence was more than an interruption. It was a challenge, a declaration, a quiet storm that demanded attention without begging for it. And as Peter's gaze locked on the child, his son, a cold realization settled over him. The past hadn't returned. It hadn't merely intruded. It had arrived, unstoppable, undeniable, and irrevocable. The room was heavy with silence, the kind that presses against the chest and forces breath to catch in midair. Peter's gaze remained locked on Bella and the tiny figure in her arms, the newborn moving gently against her chest, a small, almost imperceptible shift that carried a weight far greater than anything else in the room. The guests murmured in low tones, whispers scattering like sparks from a fire, each voice carrying speculation, judgment, and curiosity that only added to the electric tension. Bella did not flinch. She did not falter. She stood as still as a statue, her eyes calm and unwavering, her lips pressed softly together, and in that stillness she radiated a quiet authority that demanded acknowledgement without a single word spoken. She had returned on her own terms, with her child, and her presence alone spoke volumes that no explanation, no declaration, and no plea could match. Julie, for the first time in the evening, found her voice, and it came sharp, high, brittle against the thick, almost suffocating air. "What is this?" she demanded. The laughter forced from her lips sounding thin and artificial against the weight of astonishment pressing down on her. Every syllable she spoke carried the desperate edge of a woman who had believed she held the upper hand, who had believed she was the center of Peter's world tonight. The room stilled further, all eyes on her as she pressed forward, shoulders tense, trying to reclaim control over an event that had spiraled far beyond her expectations. But even as she spoke, her voice seemed to falter under the invisible pressure emanating from Bella and the child. The baby, unaware of the stakes, yawned softly and shifted, a movement that seemed to underline the truth no one could escape. Peter felt his chest tighten as 1,000 thoughts collided in his mind. Timelines, conversations, forgotten promises, mistakes the entire past decade seemed to unravel in a single moment. He had left, believing he had closed chapters, believing he had moved on flawlessly, believing the life he was building now would remain unchallenged. And yet here she was, the living proof of choices he had ignored, consequences he had failed to anticipate, and a child he had never known existed. His hand twitched instinctively, a reflex born of decades of control and authority, but he did not move. He wanted to reach, to speak, to assert some dominion over the scene, but the air felt thick, resistant, as though the room itself refused to allow him passage. Every instinct screamed that he should act, yet every fiber of his being understood that any movement could shatter the fragile thread of composure that held him upright. Whispers swirled like smoke, carrying fragmented sentences, some trying to piece together a scandal, others simply shocked into disbelief. Is that Peter? Did he know? A child? The fragments formed a chorus of questions that had no answer, a background noise that only highlighted the absolute stillness of Bella. She did not react to the speculation. She did not nod, did not explain, did did not even blink with recognition toward the room. Her silence was deliberate, and piercing, and in that silence she held the power that Peter had spent years believing he commanded. The crowd could sense the shift. Control had slipped from his hands, and the stage he had built so meticulously for his announcement was now a fragile facade against an undeniable truth. Peter's thoughts turned jagged. How had she discovered the pregnancy? How had she carried this secret so effortlessly, so deliberately? He remembered the divorce, the bitterness, the coldness of his own decisions. He remembered the nights of endless meetings, the hours he had dedicated to empire building, the choices that had left her alone in the quiet, waiting for a love he had chosen to neglect. Now, standing here, he realized the magnitude of his absence. The child, barely a week old, was the living embodiment of those choices, a mirror reflecting the moments he had missed, the promises he had forsaken, the life he had assumed would be his alone to navigate. Instinctively, Peter took a step forward. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of a man confronting the undeniable consequences of his own actions. Bella, as if sensing the motion, turned slightly away from him, shifting the child in her arms protectively. There was no confrontation, no accusation, only the quiet assertion that she alone dictated the pace, the narrative, and the terms of engagement. Peter froze, a cold realization settling like frost over his carefully maintained composure. Control was no longer his. It had been a gift he had squandered, a currency he had assumed infinite, and now, in this room glittering with wealth and attention, it was gone. Julie's eyes narrowed, scanning the interaction with thinly veiled anxiety. She had believed the announcement was a declaration of inevitability, that Peter's life had moved forward, that her presence at his side was secure and unquestioned. Yet with every glance between Peter and Bella, she could see the subtle cracks forming in his armor. He hesitated, body tense, lips pressed, eyes wide, caught between the demands of propriety, expectation, and an undeniable personal revelation. She tried to intervene again, to assert herself, to reclaim the narrative, but her words fell flat against the silence. Bella maintained. The crowd, sensing the tension, shifted uncomfortably, some murmuring, some frozen, all aware that the story unfolding before them was not scripted and not under the control of the man they had come to admire for power and precision. Peter's heart hammered as realization after realization struck. The baby's eyes opened again, bright and aware, and he saw his own reflection staring back. The weight of fatherhood, absent from his life, until this moment, crashed down with a force he could not deny. The whispers of the crowd became a distant hum. His focus narrowed to Bella and the child. Every strategy he had ever used to manipulate perception, every smile, every speech, every public gesture, all of it dissolved against the raw, unyielding truth in front of him. This was no longer a game, no longer a performance. This was consequence, delivered with the precision of inevitability. Bella's gaze shifted subtly, and Peter caught the faintest hint of a message without words. She was in control. She had chosen the moment, chosen the silence, chosen the impact, and he was left with the raw, suffocating awareness that nothing he did now could rewrite the present. He stepped again, closer this time, and felt the fragile, electric tension pull at him. Every movement had meaning, every breath had weight, and yet Bella remained unmoved, the child a living barrier between him and the control he so desperately craved. The hall seemed to shrink around him. Julie's voice faltered again, the edge of panic threading through her carefully cultivated composure. Cameras clicked uncertainly, flashes illuminating the tension, but even technology could not capture the subtle, almost imperceptible power shifting in the room. Peter realized, with a cold, sinking dread, that he had never faced anything like this. A presence so composed, so deliberate, so immovable, that his wealth, his status, and his performance were meaningless against the quiet authority of a woman and her newborn child. The murmurs grew louder, some guests daring to speculate openly, their questions slicing through the heavy air. How? How did he not know? Was this planned? Who is the father? Each fragment of curiosity struck Peter like a blow, slicing away layers of his control. Bella, however, remained an unshakable center, her presence a silent challenge, her silence a declaration. This moment, this truth, was hers to command. Peter froze again, aware that any step forward, any word spoken, could tip the delicate balance, could fracture the tenuous control he still clung to, like a raft in a storm. And in that charged, suffocating silence, Peter understood the undeniable truth. The room no longer obeyed him. The performance was over. The past was here, delivered in flesh, in breath, in a newborn's gaze, and he had no choice but to face the consequences. Every instinct, every learned skill, every strategy of power he had wielded for decades was now powerless in the face of what Bella had orchestrated silently, deliberately, and with absolute certainty. Control had slipped from his grasp, irretrievable, and in that moment he realized the gravity of his failures, the weight of the decisions he had long ignored, and the immovable presence of the consequence now standing before him. Outside, the winter air struck sharply, cold enough to burn lungs and cheeks alike, snowflakes swirling around the grand entrance of the Blackwood mansion, settling silently on the ground like a white blanket, concealing the chaos inside. Peter followed Bella instinctively, each step heavy, his polished leather shoes crunching against the icy driveway. But the sound was insignificant against the roar of thoughts in his mind. For the first time in years, the weight of arrogance, of control, of the carefully constructed image of dominance he had carried everywhere, had been stripped from him. He moved forward, but each step carried hesitation, a rare fracture in his otherwise unyielding confidence, as though the cold could pierce not just his skin, but the armor of decades he had built around his emotions. Bella stopped abruptly, just beyond the gates where the snow lay thicker, her figure silhouetted against the pale glow of winter streetlights. She did not halt for drama, for spectacle, or to savor the shock she had caused inside the mansion. Her posture was straight, composed, deliberate, her hands adjusting the blanket around the baby, securing him against the cold, a silent assertion of control in her own space. Peter's eyes tracked the motion, his chest tightening, his pulse accelerating not from anger, but from the suffocating gravity of understanding. Every instinct in him screamed to reach for her, to grab her hand, to demand answers, to apologize, to fix a past he had assumed he could rewrite. But the knowledge of what she had endured before, during, and after the divorce stopped him mid-step. The snow fell heavier now, coating his hair and shoulders, tiny crystalline flakes melting against the warmth of his skin, but he barely noticed. Bella's voice cut through the winter air, calm, unwavering, precise. "He is 8 days old," she said simply, gesturing to the child cradled against her chest. The words landed like hammer strikes against Peter's chest. 8 days. 8 days of life, of quiet growth, of discovery. 8 days in which he had been absent, entirely, unaware, and yet still intrinsically connected to the truth he could neither deny nor escape. Peter's throat tightened. The world he had known, the world in which he was in control, was suddenly irrelevant. The child had no knowledge of wealth, status, or public perception, but his very existence forced Peter to confront failures he had long ignored. Bella continued, each word measured, deliberate. "I discovered I was pregnant weeks after the divorce," she said. Her gaze locked on his, steady and unyielding. There was no accusation, no pleading, no flicker of emotional manipulation, just clarity. Peter's mind raced, reconstructing timelines, piecing together the days he had neglected, the calls he had ignored, the nights he had spent in offices and boardrooms while she faced everything alone. The realization struck with relentless force. He had missed the most crucial moments of her life, had failed to be present when presence mattered most. His hands twitched again, an unconscious attempt to bridge the distance. But he understood now that no gesture, no apology, no charm could erase the choices he had made. Snow continued to fall around them, glistening in the dim light, settling into Peter's hair, his coat, the folds of Bella's black winter attire. Each flake seemed to emphasize the passage of time, the inevitability of consequences, the cold truth that could not be undone. And then she reminded him, with a sharp calmness that left no room for argument, why they had divorced at all. When I collapsed from exhaustion during a medical scare, you chose a board meeting over the hospital, she said softly, yet every word carried a weight that reverberated through him like ice striking bare skin. He remembered, and in remembering, he felt a mix of guilt and disbelief. He had considered his actions rational, justified by business obligations, by the demands of empire. But now, those reasons rang hollow, pathetic, insufficient against the raw truth of neglect. Peter opened his mouth, searching for words, for excuses, for something to reclaim his dignity, but nothing came. He had none. The silence between them was not awkward. It was loaded, charged, suffocating in its completeness. Bella did not scream, did not plead, did not collapse into theatrics as some might have in the face of abandonment and betrayal. She chose dignity instead. Her hands shifted the baby, keeping him close, protective, a living shield against the chaos of emotions that Peter could no longer contain. And in that moment, he realized that dignity, controlled, measured, and deliberate, was far more powerful than any display of anger, fear, or desperation he could muster. The wind picked up, tossing strands of her hair against her face, brushing across Peter's cheek, biting at his ears. He took a cautious step forward, voice breaking slightly as he asked the question he had long avoided. What do you want from me?" The words, so simple, so ordinary, carried the weight of years of absence, of mistakes, of unspoken regrets, of a life lived without understanding the stakes. Bella looked at him, her eyes clear, unflinching, a mirror reflecting his own failures back at him. "Nothing," she said plainly. "Nothing. No demands, no ultimatums, no threats, no pleas, just the cold, unyielding clarity of a woman who had survived without him and would continue to do so." Peter reached out instinctively, but she stepped back before his fingers could close the gap. That movement, subtle yet deliberate, terrified him more than any argument, any confrontation, any anger ever could. The space between them was more than physical. It was a chasm forged from years of neglect, absence, and emotional failure. His chest tightened, his pulse surged, and every ounce of learned control he had relied upon crumbled under the weight of the truth. The baby stirred, tiny fingers curling around Bella's coat, a reminder that he was witnessing not just a consequence, but a life irrevocably tied to choices he had made and ignored. Snowflakes clung to Peter's coat, melting slowly, leaving wet streaks like the proof of impermanence. He realized he could not charm his way back, could not force forgiveness, could not manipulate outcomes as he had in boardrooms and social gatherings for years. The world of power, control, and performance had no place here. Only presence mattered, only acknowledgement, only humility. He inhaled sharply, cold air filling his lungs, attempting to steady his thoughts, attempting to anchor himself to the moment, rather than being swept away by the guilt and awe that threatened to drown him. Bella's gaze did not waver. She held the baby, silent, unshakable, radiating the calm authority of someone who had endured, survived, and now dictated the terms of engagement. Peter's mind worked frantically, attempting to process the implications, the next steps, the boundaries he could not cross, the trust he had to earn rather than demand. The wind gusted again, tossing snow into his hair and over his coat. Yet the cold could not compare to the chill settling in his chest. He understood now that his divorce had been earned, that his absence had consequences beyond anything he could have imagined, and that any hope of reclaiming what he had lost would demand more than wealth, more than charm. It would demand an entirely new self. The street lamps cast long shadows across the icy driveway, stretching toward him as if mocking his inability to bridge the distance between himself and the woman and child he had abandoned. He took a tentative step forward, then another. Each movement hesitant, deliberate, heavy with uncertainty. Bella shifted slightly, and the child stirred again, tiny eyes opening to the cold, to the world, to a father he did not yet know. Peter froze, knowing that every step, every word, every decision from this point forward would be under scrutiny, measured against years of absence, neglect, and failed choices. The snow fell relentlessly, each flake a reminder that time moved forward regardless of intention, and that he could not undo the past, only face it, earn trust, and hope it was not too late. 4. Inside the mansion, the warmth of chandeliers and the murmur of elite guests could not mask the tension that now radiated like a pulse from the very walls. Julie's posture remained impeccable, her designer gown perfectly draped, her mask of composure unbroken, but beneath the surface, every calculation of her mind raced. She had been confident, even triumphant, for much of the evening, convinced that Peter's announced engagement and her poised presence were proof enough that she held the narrative, that she was the one with authority over the perception of his life. But the interruption, the quiet, devastating reappearance of Bella with the newborn child, had shattered every assumption. Still, Julie did not collapse. She measured, she assessed, she considered every angle. Every whisper from the crowd, every flash of camera, every startled glance among guests became data points she filed away. In her eyes, panic had no place. Only precision mattered. Peter stood slightly apart, the residue of disbelief still clinging to him, the memory of snow outside still vivid, the echo of Bella's calm, undeniable authority ringing in his mind. And then he felt it, a cold awareness that Julie, for all her composure, was thinking faster, planning farther, seeking control where he had lost it. She approached him slowly, not with anger, not with accusation, but with the subtle dominance of intellect. "Peter," she began, her voice smooth, measured, yet carrying an edge sharp enough to cut through the fog of his mind. "The world will not forgive this. Investors will not wait for scandal to settle. A newborn child with an ex-wife will stain everything you've worked to build." Each word landed like a calculated strike, her tone leaving no room for hesitation. Peter felt the weight of reality pressing in from every direction, her intelligence acting as a lens through which he saw the fragility of his empire, the illusion of control he had carried for years. Her reasoning was cold, efficient, but not cruel. She did not shout, she did not demand, she did not plead. Instead, she presented options with clarity. Lawyers could structure arrangements to contain the fallout. Silence could be maintained to protect his public image. Distance could be preserved between him and Bella, while controlled involvement ensured responsibility without exposure. Peter's mind swirled with the logic of it, the allure of a solution that almost made sense. Stability, she implied, mattered more than emotion. For a moment, her words made the chaos outside the room seem manageable, almost solvable. He glimpsed the possibility of regaining some semblance of order, some foothold on the life he thought he had mastered. But it was in that clarity that Peter finally saw the truth Bella had been quietly delivering all along. She had never cared about image, about perception, about the calculations of society or investors. Bella had always spoken of responsibility, of integrity, of presence and action in their shared lives. She had demanded accountability through silence, through boundaries, through the quiet power of refusal and dignity. Julie's words, rational and precise, suddenly felt hollow compared to the undeniable moral weight carried by Bella's deliberate choices. Peter realized, with sharp, uncomfortable clarity, that the man he had been performing as the confident, untouchable, image-conscious CEO was nothing more than a facade. He had not healed, had not learned, had only performed recovery for appearances. The room seemed to shrink around him as Julie's presence pressed in with both elegance and authority. She spoke of love, her love, but it was tempered by reason. She told him, calmly, that she loved him, yes, but she loved stability, order, and predictability even more. Her logic, unassailable in its structure, forced him to see the stakes of his failures outside the intimate sphere of personal regret. Peter felt a faint, almost shameful recognition of how deeply he had underestimated her intellect, her capacity to process, to act, to protect herself and her position in ways that required no dramatic outbursts. She offered solutions, yes, but more importantly, she offered a mirror. Look at yourself, Peter, and see what you have built, and what you have failed to guard against. As the evening progressed, Peter realized he had no answer that could counter her reasoning. Every gesture, every word, every display of confidence he had relied on for years now seemed inconsequential in the face of her calm analysis. And so, he made a choice. Though it was not sudden, nor entirely conscious at first, he cancelled the wedding publicly, not quietly, not discreetly, but in a way that left no room for ambiguity. The room froze as the announcement echoed, the fallout immediate and undeniable. Cameras flashed, gossip rippled like wildfire, and yet Julie left with her dignity intact, her composure unshaken yet without him. Peter sat in stunned silence, the applause, the murmurs, the curiosity of the elite guests fading into background noise against the roar of realization in his own mind. He understood then, painfully, that he had not healed after Bella. Every display of charm, every attempt at recovery, every carefully constructed performance of moving on had been an illusion. He had performed recovery, yes, but he had not confronted the true consequences of his past choices, had not acknowledged the depth of neglect, the weight of absence, the cost of arrogance. Now, stripped of ceremony, stripped of the illusion of control, stripped of the performance that had defined him for years, Peter felt the raw, unfiltered truth pressing against his chest. He had been undone not by scandal, not by gossip, but by clarity, by the calm intelligence of two women who refused to bend to his timeline, his rules, his ego. Julie's absence lingered, leaving an empty weight in the room. But the implications of her presence and the reasoning she had delivered continued to press down. Peter realized that every decision he had made, every ambition he had pursued at the expense of others, had consequences. The world outside, the empire he had built, the image he had polished, all of it was fragile, dependent on perception, susceptible to the quiet, unyielding truths of those he had disregarded. He understood in that moment that redemption, reconciliation, or even stability could not be granted through charm or wealth. They had to be earned, and every step of earning would be measured, deliberate, and unrelenting. The lights of the mansion glinted against the polished floors, reflecting shards of glass-like perfection. Yet Peter could see none of it. The glittering event that had begun as a celebration now felt hollow, artificial, a backdrop to the unassailable truths he could not escape. Each step he had taken toward power, control, and performance now seemed almost irrelevant against the clear, precise, and piercing logic of Julie's intelligence, and more importantly, against the moral gravity of Bella's presence, her child, and the life that now demanded his attention. For the first time, Peter understood that he had performed recovery without truly confronting the past, and that the lessons of presence, responsibility, and consequence would not be learned overnight, nor through announcements, nor through carefully calculated charm. 5. Peter's arrival was deliberately understated. No flashbulbs greeted him, no reporters scribbled notes at the curb, no cameras caught the curve of his expensive suit. He stepped quietly into Bella's apartment, his polished confidence stripped to bare awareness. Every movement was measured, every step intentional, as though the silence itself carried weight. He carried nothing, no gifts, no apologies rehearsed into brittle speeches, no declarations meant to impress or perform. The world outside, with its glare of judgment and expectation, had no bearing here. He had learned painfully that presence mattered more than power, that action spoke louder than announcements, and that consistency, the quiet, invisible reliability of someone who could be counted upon, was a currency far stronger than charm or wealth. The first moments with his son were tentative. He approached slowly, crouching beside Bella, who held the child against her chest like a shield and an anchor. The boy stirred, tiny hands pressing against her coat, eyes fluttering open with a fragile awareness of the world around him. Peter extended his hand, a gesture of permission rather than possession, waiting for Bella's nod before reaching closer. When he finally cradled his son, the sensation was overwhelming. The weight of life, the warmth of skin, the fragile pulse of breath, and with it came the crushing awareness of what he had lost, what he had been absent from, and what he now had to earn. No entitlement, no expectation. Only the patience to prove himself day after day, moment after moment, under the scrutiny of a woman whose boundaries had been tested and honed by experience. Bella observed him carefully, her eyes never leaving the subtle movements of his hands, the way he adjusted the boy against his chest, the way he inhaled and exhaled with care. She tested him silently, demanding endurance rather than compliance, attention rather than charm, and respect rather than performance. When he suggested stepping forward too soon, when he whispered a word that felt like overreach, she corrected him gently, calmly, without anger, letting him feel the friction of patience instead of permission. He accepted it, swallowed the sting of humility, and reminded himself that forgiveness was never owed. It could not be forced, it could not be purchased, and it could not be assumed simply because of love or wealth or guilt or history. Days became weeks. Peter arrived at consistent times, not announced, not heralded, simply present. He learned the rhythms of the boy's life, the timing of feeding, the subtle cues of exhaustion, the way small hands gripped his fingers unconsciously, and how Bella moved and breathed with protective vigilance. He followed her rules without argument, without negotiation, without ego. Each small victory, being allowed to hold the child, being included in a decision, earning a nod of approval, was a victory of trust rather than assertion. Every refusal, every boundary maintained, reminded him that presence was earned, not demanded, and that the consequences of arrogance were permanent unless repaired by consistency, respect, and humility. The world outside remained unaware of the private battles unfolding in quiet corners of Bella's home. Peter's company surged in the media, rumors, whispers, speculation, but he ignored it all. The most public act he undertook was shocking in its simplicity. He transferred voting control of his company, stepping back from daily dominance, signaling a relinquishment of power without pomp, without announcement, leaving the press and shareholders scrambling for answers. Panic rippled through the business world. Analysts predicted collapse, investors feared instability, headlines screamed uncertainty. Yet inside, Bella remained unmoved, her calm demeanor undisturbed, a subtle reminder that true power was not wielded in public theater, but in measured patience, deliberate decisions, and the quiet consistency of action over words. Peter felt the weight of that lesson settle deep in his chest. This was not about reclaiming love. He had mistaken confidence for commitment, charm for devotion, and presence for entitlement. Bella's refusal to bend, to manipulate, or to accept anything less than consistent respect reminded him that the right to remain in their lives had to be earned continuously. The child, nestled against her chest, became the center of a universe he had once ignored, and the gravity of responsibility pressed against him more acutely than any boardroom failure or public embarrassment ever could. Each day, each gesture, each patient moment became an unspoken test, a measure of whether he had truly changed, or was merely performing another recovery. He learned to speak less, to listen more. The words that once commanded attention were replaced by small acts, fixing a bottle at the right moment, responding to a subtle cue from the baby, offering a quiet hand when Bella's energy waned, moving without expectation, loving without claim. Each act, invisible to the outside world, weighed heavily on him, building a bridge of trust step by step. Mini victories punctuated each day: the baby's faint smile, a glance of acknowledgement from Bella, a nod that carried approval rather than acquiescence. These were proofs without privilege, rewards earned, not demanded, and they burned into him a stark understanding of the cost of absence and the effort required to reclaim a place he had once assumed was his by right. Every test Bella imposed was a silent reminder: forgiveness was never owed, love was never guaranteed, and control was an illusion unless continuously proven. Peter endured. He endured the quiet, the patience, the limitations, and the small, almost invisible rejections that stung more sharply than any public humiliation could. He felt the gradual rebuilding of trust, fragile as ice on a river, ready to crack under misstep, yet strengthened incrementally by persistence, humility, and presence. The media screamed about his absence from power, but he ignored it, understanding that the true measure of his change would never be broadcast in headlines. Even the smallest interactions became loaded with significance. When the baby reached for him, he paused, allowing Bella to interpret, to guide, to approve. When she said no, he respected the refusal, swallowing his ego. When she offered consent, he cherished it as evidence that trust could be rebuilt, brick by deliberate brick. The intimacy of shared responsibility, of consistent presence without entitlement, forged a connection stronger than any declaration, more binding than any contract, and infinitely more valuable than any public display of affection. And Peter finally understood, fully and painfully, that this was the proof without privilege, that love could not be claimed through status, that forgiveness was earned through consistency, that presence outweighed charm, and that respect was the currency that governed the fragile bonds of family. The boy in his arms stirred, and Peter felt an unspoken promise pass between them, not of possession, not of entitlement, but of a right to remain, granted slowly, carefully, deliberately, in every patient, quiet moment he endured and proved himself worthy. The world outside was unforgiving, relentless, and loud, a sharp contrast to the quiet, deliberate presence Peter had cultivated in Bella's life. Deals he had spent years negotiating began to crumble, unraveling in hours. Boardrooms that once buzzed with his authority now hummed with panic, whispers, and outright revolt. Investors, accustomed to certainty, recoiled at what they saw as instability, questioning leadership, doubting judgment, and speculating on collapse. Peter felt the pressure, the sting of reputation under siege, but he did not flinch, did not counter, did not attempt to manipulate perception with charm or declarations. For the first time, he chose endurance over intervention. He absorbed the consequences of his decisions as a patient observer, allowing the world to witness his power erode without interference. And in that choice, he felt the weight of humility pressed down harder than any business crisis ever had. Julie's presence, or rather the echo of it, remained a distant ghost in the corridors of his public life. She gave one final interview, smooth, poised, devastating in its restraint. Her words were measured, articulate, precise. She didn't attack, didn't accuse, and didn't display vulnerability. Instead, she reframed the narrative, emphasizing professionalism, responsibility, and personal boundaries. The interview was like a scalpel, cutting through illusions of control and authority Peter had carefully maintained. He did not respond publicly. He did not rebut. He had learned painfully that response was not required, that public perception was a theater he no longer needed to dominate, and that the cost of silence could be greater than the cost of words if managed with strategy and restraint. Bella watched from a distance, quietly, invisibly, observing not only Peter's actions but the nuances in his approach to the storm he could not buy back. Influence slipped from his hands, reputation teetered, and control fractured, yet there was no anger, no desperation, no panic. He endured. He did not fight to reclaim what the world demanded. Instead, he bore the loss with a steady, unspoken resolve. Bella saw the change, subtle but undeniable, the difference between a man performing dominance and a man understanding consequence. She recognized the lessons he had learned in silence. Presence was earned, respect could not be demanded, and endurance outweighed performance. Yet Bella did not let him close emotionally. She had learned the hard lessons of love and absence. Trust was fragile, vulnerability could be weaponized against her, and safety, emotional, physical, and mental, was a priority that could not be compromised. She kept him at a measured distance, observing, evaluating, testing, and ensuring that the transformation he claimed was real, not performance. The child in her arms, now growing with each day, was a constant reminder that the stakes were too high for assumptions, that love had previously cost her safety, and that repetition of past mistakes was unacceptable. Peter endured, silently aware of the scrutiny, silently accepting her pace, and silently proving that change was more than words. It was action sustained over time. The city buzzed outside. Headlines screamed of mismanagement and unexpected corporate retreats. Analysts predicted financial instability, and yet Peter remained in quiet, deliberate focus. Each decision he had made, to step back, to relinquish control, to bear the consequences without manipulation, was a test of character and patience, not a gesture of performance. Mini victories marked the passage of time, a nod of approval from Bella, a moment of trust, a fleeting smile at a shared joke with their son. Each instance reinforced the painstaking reality that love could not be commanded, that trust could not be demanded, and that redemption required sustained effort, not declaration. Peter felt the isolation acutely. Friends, colleagues, and allies who had once flattered him now questioned his judgment. Invitations dwindled. Boardroom chairs remained empty, and public scrutiny intensified. Yet he did not falter, did not attempt to reclaim what had slipped, and did not react with pride or outrage. Instead, he endured, absorbing each subtle attack, each raised eyebrow, each pointed comment, with a patience and humility that surprised even himself. The world tested him, but Bella's silent observation tested him more, because here there were no performances to fall back on, no cameras to manipulate, no applause to disguise failure. Bella began to notice the subtle shifts. The man who once sought dominance, approval, and performance was learning endurance, patience, and respect. She observed the quiet consistency in his interactions with their son, the way he absorbed rebukes and boundaries without complaint, and the deliberate manner in which he refrained from projecting power where it was unnecessary. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, her internal calculations began to shift. She began to question what frightened her more: the prospect of losing him again, which had been her lifelong fear, or the possibility that he had truly changed, that he had endured without entitlement, and that he had absorbed lessons the world could not teach him. In the still moments, away from cameras and crowds, Bella noted the endurance etched in his expression, the quiet acceptance of consequences, the measured response to public and private loss, the careful attention he gave to their son's needs without seeking reward or recognition. Each gesture, subtle and deliberate, carried meaning far deeper than any public statement. She realized that love, previously costly, could now be considered safe, careful, measured, yet profoundly present. Yet the question remained: would she allow herself to trust, or would caution outweigh hope even in the presence of undeniable change? Peter's internal battle mirrored the external chaos. Each failing deal, each collapsed partnership, each questioning shareholder was a tangible reminder of the cost of choices made long ago. And yet he did not curse his fate. Instead, he used the losses as a mirror, reflecting on mistakes, endurance, and the necessity of proving worth beyond mere performance. The private victories, the nods, the quiet smiles, the shared moments of responsibility with his son were invisible to the public, yet far more critical. They represented a slow reclamation of presence, trust, and respect, not through power, but through patience and sustained proof. Even in the public eye, the subtlety of his transformation began to make an impact. Analysts speculated about strength born of resilience rather than dominance. Investors hesitated, unsure whether panic or patience would govern outcomes. Yet Peter remained detached from speculation, focused entirely on actions that mattered privately, honoring boundaries, showing respect, and proving through consistency that he could endure without expectation, without entitlement, and without performance. The cost of choosing was absolute. He could not buy back influence, reputation, or control, but he could demonstrate change, one patient moment at a time. Bella's internal conflict reached a turning point during one particularly quiet evening. Watching Peter interact gently with their son, observing his unwavering patience, noting the absence of self-interest, she felt the subtle pull of reconsideration. Could she trust this endurance, this proof through action rather than words? Or would her fear of loss, informed by past experience, dominate reason? She remained poised, cautious, yet the walls around her heart began to reveal fissures. Slowly, painfully, the question she had avoided for years crept forward. Was she more afraid of losing him again, or more afraid of allowing herself to believe that he had truly changed? The world outside was unforgiving, relentless, and loud, a sharp contrast to the quiet, deliberate presence Peter had cultivated in Bella's life. Deals he had spent years negotiating began to crumble, unraveling in hours. Boardrooms that once buzzed with his authority now hummed with panic, whispers, and outright revolt. Investors, accustomed to certainty, recoiled at what they saw as instability, questioning leadership, doubting judgment, and speculating on collapse. Peter felt the pressure, the sting of reputation under siege, but he did not flinch, did not counter, did not attempt to manipulate perception with charm or declarations. For the first time, he chose endurance over intervention. He absorbed the consequences of his decisions as a patient observer, allowing the world to witness his power erode without interference, and in that choice he felt the weight of humility press down harder than any business crisis ever had. Julie's presence, or rather the echo of it, remained a distant ghost in the corridors of his public life. She gave one final interview, smooth, poised, devastating in its restraint. Her words were measured, articulate, precise. She didn't attack, didn't accuse, and didn't display vulnerability. Instead, she reframed the narrative, emphasizing professionalism, responsibility, and personal boundaries. The interview was like a scalpel, cutting through illusions of control and authority Peter had carefully maintained. He did not respond publicly. He did not rebut. He had learned painfully that response was not required, that public perception was a theater he no longer needed to dominate, and that the cost of silence could be greater than the cost of words if managed with strategy and restraint. Bella watched from a distance, quietly, invisibly, observing not only Peter's actions, but the nuances in his approach to the storm. He could not buy back. Influence slipped from his hands, reputation teetered, and control fractured. Yet there was no anger, no desperation, no panic. He endured. He did not fight to reclaim what the world demanded. Instead, he bore the loss with a steady, unspoken resolve. Bella saw the change, subtle but undeniable, the difference between a man performing dominance and a man understanding consequence. She recognized the lessons he had learned in silence. Presence was earned, respect could not be demanded, and endurance outweighed performance. Yet Bella did not let him close emotionally. She had learned the hard lessons of love and absence. Trust was fragile, vulnerability could be weaponized against her, and safety, emotional, physical, and mental, was a priority that could not be compromised. She kept him at a measured distance, observing, evaluating, testing, and ensuring that the transformation he claimed was real, not performance. The child in her arms, now growing with each day, was a constant reminder that the stakes were too high for assumptions, that love had previously cost her safety, and that repetition of past mistakes was unacceptable. Peter endured, silently aware of the scrutiny, silently accepting her pace, and silently proving that change was more than words, it was action sustained over time. The city buzzed outside, headlines screamed of mismanagement and unexpected corporate retreats, analysts predicted financial instability, and yet Peter remained in quiet, deliberate focus. Each decision he had made, to step back, to relinquish control, to bear the consequences without manipulation, was a test of character and patience, not a gesture of performance. Many victories marked the passage of time. A nod of approval from Bella, a moment of trust, a fleeting smile at a shared joke with their son. Each instance reinforced the painstaking reality that love could not be commanded, that trust could not be demanded, and that redemption required sustained effort, not declaration. Peter felt the isolation acutely. Friends, colleagues, and allies who had once flattered him now questioned his judgment. Invitations dwindled, boardroom chairs remained empty, and public scrutiny intensified. Yet he did not falter, did not attempt to reclaim what had slipped, and did not react with pride or outrage. Instead, he endured, absorbing each subtle attack, each raised eyebrow, each pointed comment, with a patience and humility that surprised even himself. The world tested him, but Bella's silent observation tested him more, because here there were no performances to fall back on, no cameras to manipulate, no applause to disguise failure. Bella began to notice the subtle shifts. The man who once sought dominance, approval, and performance was learning endurance, patience, and respect. She observed the quiet consistency in his interactions with their son, the way he absorbed rebukes and boundaries without complaint, and the deliberate manner in which he refrained from projecting power where it was unnecessary. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, her internal calculations began to shift. She began to question what frightened her more, the prospect of losing him again, which had been her lifelong fear, or the possibility that he had truly changed, that he had endured without entitlement, and that he had absorbed lessons the world could not teach him. In the still moments, away from cameras and crowds, Bella noted the endurance etched in his expression, the quiet acceptance of consequences, the measured response to public and private loss, the careful attention he gave to their son's needs without seeking reward or recognition. Each gesture, subtle and deliberate, carried meaning far deeper than any public statement. She realized that love, previously costly, could now be considered safe, careful, measured, yet profoundly present. Yet the question remained, would she allow herself to trust, or would caution outweigh hope, even in the presence of undeniable change? Peter's internal battle mirrored the external chaos. Each failing deal, each collapsed partnership, each questioning shareholder was a tangible reminder of the cost of choices made long ago, and yet he did not curse his fate. Instead, he used the losses as a learning experience, mirror, reflecting on mistakes, endurance, and the necessity of proving worth beyond mere performance. The private victories, the nods, the quiet smiles, the shared moments of responsibility with his son were invisible to the public, yet far more critical. They represented a slow reclamation of presence, trust, and respect, not through power, but through patience and sustained proof. Even in the public eye, the subtlety of his transformation began to make an impact. Analysts speculated about strength born of resilience rather than dominance. Investors hesitated, unsure whether panic or patience would govern outcomes. Yet Peter remained detached from speculation, focused entirely on actions that mattered privately. Honoring boundaries, showing respect, and proving through consistency that he could endure without expectation, without entitlement, and without performance. The cost of choosing was absolute. He could not buy back influence, reputation, or control, but he could demonstrate change, one patient moment at a time. Bella's internal conflict reached a turning point during one particularly quiet evening. Watching Peter interact gently with their son, observing his unwavering patience, noting the absence of self-interest, she felt the subtle pull of reconsideration. Could she trust this endurance, this proof through action rather than words, or would her fear of loss, informed by past experience, dominate reason? She remained poised, cautious, yet the walls around her heart began to reveal fissures. Slowly, painfully, the question she had avoided for years crept forward. Was she more afraid of losing him again, or more afraid of allowing herself to believe that he had truly changed? Night had settled over the city like a velvet curtain, the skyline dotted with the cold, distant glow of lights that seemed indifferent to human struggle. Inside Bella's apartment, the atmosphere was quieter, heavier, almost sacred in its intimacy. The boy slept in a bassinet nearby, his steady breaths a rhythmic reminder of the responsibility Peter had once avoided, and now quietly bore. Peter stood by the window, gazing out at the city he had once tried to control. The streets and towers below now powerless to influence the truths he could not escape. The weight of weeks, months, and years of absence pressed against him, heavier than any business setback, any public humiliation, any collapse of influence. Bella sat on the edge of the sofa, hands folded over her lap, the soft glow of a single lamp illuminating the sharp clarity of her face. Her posture was deliberate, restrained, and yet every line of her body exuded tension. The tension of a woman who had carried a child alone, endured the quiet pain of absence, and had learned to protect herself from the unpredictability of a man who once promised presence but delivered neglect. For hours, neither spoke, the air thick with unspoken truths. The silence punctuated only by the faint whir of a ceiling fan and the occasional sigh from Peter, a man unaccustomed to helplessness in the face of moral reckoning. Finally, her voice broke the tension, quiet but unyielding. "Peter," she began, each word measured as though carved from stone. Childbirth was lonely. The admission was simple, almost clinical in tone, yet it reverberated through the room with the force of an avalanche. Peter's chest tightened, the air seemed to thin, and for the first time he felt the full weight of his absence. Not the abstract consequence of divorce or neglect, but the intimate, daily suffering that had defined her life while he had been absent. Her words did not accuse. They did not seek to wound. They simply stated truth, a truth he had long avoided, a truth that could not be negotiated, manipulated, or performed around. Her gaze did not waver as she continued, her eyes reflecting the faint glow of the lamp like mirrors to her soul. "Silence hurts more than abandonment," she said. The simplicity of the statement belied its depth. Peter's mind raced through memories, trying to reconcile the moments he had ignored calls, skipped visits, and left her alone in the quiet of the hospital, the apartment, the nights when his presence mattered most. The pain in her voice was not anger, not bitterness. It was the concentrated energy of isolation, of endurance, of a life carried alone. He could not speak, could not defend, could not explain. There were no excuses that could erase months of solitude, no intentions that could repair the cracks in her trust, no justifications that could bring back the hours he had squandered. Her next words pierced even deeper. Love suffocates under arrogance. Peter flinched at the honesty, at the naked clarity of her observation. The arrogance he had once carried as a shield, a weapon, and a performance now appeared to him in its rawest form, a barrier that had suffocated intimacy, blocked empathy, and demanded loyalty without presence. Every instinct to justify, to explain, to reclaim authority over perception vanished under the weight of her truth. He accepted it all, quietly, without interruption, without protest, allowing the words to settle, to carve themselves into his understanding of failure and responsibility. The room seemed to hold its breath. Peter, who had commanded boardrooms, dominated markets, and performed influence with ease, now stood powerless before the moral gravity of a woman who had endured and emerged unbroken, yet unyielding. He saw in her eyes not weakness, but the measured authority of experience. He understood for the first time that power in intimacy was never about status, charm, or wealth. It was about presence, reliability, and the acceptance of consequence without evasion. Every fiber of his being recognized that no performance, no public act, no display of affection could substitute for sustained trust, earned quietly and consistently. Then he spoke, his voice low but firm, carrying the weight of months of reflection and lessons learned. "I don't want forgiveness now," he said, the words deliberate, almost a vow, almost a contract with the moment itself. "I want a lifetime where you never doubt my presence again." The declaration was not about absolution. It was not about charming her back or reclaiming lost authority. It was about endurance, about commitment without condition, about presence as a responsibility rather than a privilege. The weight of his honesty struck the room like a tidal wave, and for the first time, Bella did not shut down. The defenses she had built over years of absence and betrayal remained, but for the first time they wavered, cracked just enough to reveal the possibility of connection. Her silence was heavy, loaded with history, with hesitation, with the careful calculation of risk. Peter waited, standing unmoving, every inch of him tense yet patient, acknowledging that the wall she had built to survive did not fall, but that it was no longer impenetrable. The subtle flicker in her eyes, the slight relaxation of her shoulders, the way her hands moved almost imperceptibly as if reconsidering the world she had so fiercely protected, all were signs that the slow, deliberate process of earning trust was beginning to take hold. Would she step forward or retreat? Would she test him, challenge him, or allow the moment of vulnerability to remain intact without response? The boy stirred in the bassinet, tiny fingers stretching, a reminder of the life that had changed everything. Peter's gaze shifted briefly, acknowledging that the stakes were not abstract. They were tangible, immediate, and irrevocable. Every decision from this night forward would carry weight. Every interaction would be measured, every promise tested against consistency and presence. Bella's eyes returned to his, holding questions unspoken, the silent inquiry of whether he could sustain this change, whether he could endure not just for moments, but for a lifetime defined by trust rather than performance. The room felt suspended in time, a quiet battlefield of honesty and endurance, of past failures confronting present choices. Peter understood that this night was pivotal. No charm, no apology, no public act could substitute for the sustained commitment he was now offering. Every breath, every subtle gesture, every measured word would be scrutinized, not for approval, but for proof. Bella's eventual response would not come as sudden forgiveness, nor as immediate surrender of boundaries. It would be earned over days, weeks, months, each moment a test of whether his words aligned with the reality of presence, patience, and accountability. And in that space, filled with the quiet rhythm of a sleeping child, the faint hum of the city beyond the windows, and the unresolved tension between them, a small but undeniable shift occurred. The wall she had built to survive did not fall, yet it had cracked just enough for possibility to seep through. Peter understood viscerally that change was never about dramatic gestures or declarations. It was about enduring, proving, and existing consistently until trust could be rebuilt slowly, deliberately, and irrevocably. Would she allow him the time and space to demonstrate that presence, or would past pain dictate the limits of their connection indefinitely? The morning light filtered through sheer curtains, soft and forgiving. Yet it carried weight for Bella. The quiet hum of the city outside contrasted with the deliberate stillness in the apartment where the boy slept nestled between blankets, his gentle breathing a reminder of the fragile life around which all choices now revolved. Bella watched Peter from across the room, noting how naturally he moved in this private world, unobserved by cameras, colleagues, or society. He didn't seek acknowledgement. He didn't perform charm or dominance. Every gesture was small, deliberate, and authentic, lifting the baby, adjusting a blanket, softly murmuring words of comfort. In those moments she realized that love wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was patient, unseen, uncelebrated, and infinitely more powerful for it. Peter's presence had transformed into something almost sacred. Each action he took was measured, guided not by pride, ego, or urgency, but by quiet devotion and respect. He didn't crowd her space, didn't assert control over routines, didn't insist on recognition for the care he now provided. Bella observed him attentively, noting how he waited for permission before interacting with their son, how he mirrored her pace, and how he honored the boundaries she had established. Every action was proof, not of entitlement, not of desperation, but of deliberate choice. The realization struck her with a weight she hadn't expected. He was no longer the man who demanded presence. He was the man who earned it. Romance began to return, subtly, almost imperceptibly. There were no grand gestures, no orchestrated events designed to impress or manipulate. Instead, it was in the quiet moments, a hand brushing against hers while reading to their son, the soft laughter that escaped when he mimicked a baby's gurgle, the gentle way he observed her opinions and decisions without interruption or criticism. The love they once lost was not resurrected. It was rebuilt, quietly, patiently, through restraint and respect. Bella felt the walls she had built to protect herself begin to shift, not crumble, not in sudden surrender, but in cautious, deliberate evaluation. Each day, each moment became a microcosm of trust, of reliability, of deliberate evolution. Peter, for his part, understood the delicacy of the moment. He had endured months of scrutiny, rejection, and the invisible tests of patience Bella imposed. He knew the difference between forgiveness and choice, between desperation and authenticity. He never rushed, never forced intimacy, never assumed entitlement. Each time Bella reached for his hand, or allowed him close to their son, it was a conscious act on her part, a deliberate acknowledgement that he had proven himself worthy of presence, not by words, not by wealth, not by charm, but by consistent, quiet action. He recognized that every gesture of hers carried meaning far deeper than the ostentatious displays of love he had once equated with connection. The child became the axis around which their evolving relationship rotated. Peter's devotion to their son was unmistakable, observed in every subtle reaction, the careful way he lifted him to avoid startling him, the patient listening when he cried, the soft encouragement during his first attempts at rolling over. Bella watched closely, noting how his patience and attentiveness demonstrated a depth of responsibility and love that words could not convey. Trust, she realized, was being rebuilt through these incremental, invisible moments. Each day brought new evidence that the man she had once doubted was no longer defined by arrogance or absence, but by deliberate presence and quiet strength. Yet Bella remained vigilant. She did not forgive him suddenly. The memory of abandonment, the shadow of loneliness, and the lessons learned from pain lingered, reminding her that choice was a process, not a singular act. Each day, she tested the boundaries subtly. She observed his reactions to minor setbacks, his response to the child's mischief, his patience when tired or frustrated. Peter endured these trials without complaint, without assertion, and without seeking recognition. Bella saw in his restraint the stark contrast between performance and authenticity, and each time he passed the unspoken test, a small crack appeared in the wall she had built, allowing trust and affection to seep through. Their conversations, once heavy with conflict or negotiation, began to carry quiet intimacy. Peter listened with attention, his responses measured, respectful, and never dismissive. He engaged not to dominate but to understand, not to command but to support. Bella noted the subtle changes, the absence of impatience, the careful avoidance of old patterns, the deliberate effort to align actions with promises. Romance was no longer loud or dramatic. It was a continuous patient evolution, expressed through care, reliability, and shared responsibility. Every interaction became a lesson in presence, a proof of transformation, and a subtle invitation for her to choose him, deliberately and consciously. Peter's restraint extended beyond their home. In public settings, in front of friends or colleagues, he maintained decorum without intrusion. He did not flaunt the child, did not dominate conversations, did not perform reconciliation for appearances. Bella observed this with quiet satisfaction, recognizing that his transformation was not for show, but internalized, consistent, and genuine. Would he falter under temptation to assert ego? Would he slip into old patterns of dominance or entitlement? Each choice, each reaction, became a silent test, and each success deepened the quiet intimacy between them. Even mundane moments became imbued with significance. Morning routines, shared meals, bedtime stories, and small gestures of care served as evidence that love was now about choice, not mercy. Bella realized that she had regained control over her heart, but this control was no longer rigid or defensive. It was deliberate and conscious. Each time she allowed him closer, each time she acknowledged his efforts, she was making a choice, not granting forgiveness. And Peter, fully aware of this, continued to earn her trust through patience, consistency, and the deliberate absence of arrogance. By the end of each day, the evolution of their relationship was tangible. The walls that had once been impenetrable had not fallen. They had shifted, cracked, and allowed light and warmth to seep through. Peter's consistent presence, respect for boundaries, and careful attention to both Bella and their child had redefined the terms of their connection. Romance had returned, but it was stronger, humbler, and more enduring than the passion they had lost. It was not an emotional surrender. It was a deliberate mutual evolution born from restraint, patience, and sacrifice. Bella's eyes, once guarded and wary, now reflected cautious hope, and Peter understood that this choice, once earned, was far more meaningful than any mercy ever could be. 9. The soft glow of Christmas lights filled the modest living room, casting a warm amber glow on walls that had once echoed silence and tension. The scent of pine mingled with cinnamon and vanilla from a small table adorned with simple decorations, a stark contrast to the grandiose chandeliers and opulence of the mansion Peter had once ruled. The space felt alive, not because it was perfect, but because it was real, lived in, fragile, and human. Peter stood near the fireplace, cradling his son in his arms, a gentle weight that demanded nothing from him but gratitude and presence. There was no ownership here, no assertion of authority, only the quiet, grounding knowledge that this life, this family, was something to nurture, honor, and protect. Bella watched from across the room, her eyes tracing Peter's movements as he adjusted the boy in his arms, murmuring soft, almost instinctive reassurances. She was beside him, yes, but not from necessity. She didn't stand there because she required his validation or presence. She stood there because she had chosen deliberately to trust him. Trust was the quiet bond that had been tested through absence, boundaries, and restraint, and it was this trust that now defined their connection more than passion, wealth, or history ever could. Each breath she took was a conscious acceptance of what had been rebuilt, not what had been lost, and she felt the subtle weight of peace settle over her like a gentle, earned warmth. The boy stirred, lifting tiny arms toward Peter's chest, his eyes fluttering open in an expression of curiosity and comfort. Peter's hands adjusted instinctively, supporting, cradling, not controlling, letting the child feel the security of love without the shadow of entitlement. In that moment he realized the depth of what he had almost lost. Not just the child, but the very essence of family, trust and quiet devotion. The fragility of life, the impermanence of relationships built on convenience or power, pressed against him, leaving no space for arrogance or performance. Every action now was deliberate, every gesture measured in the currency of presence. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily, catching the dim light of the street lamps, as if the world itself paused to acknowledge the quiet transformation inside. No photographers, no reporters, no cameras, just the soft hush of winter and the steady rhythm of a family learning to exist in equilibrium. Peter's mind wandered briefly to the past. The mansions, the deals, the staged announcements, the illusions of control. None of it mattered anymore. The only reality that held weight was the small life in his arms, the woman beside him who had taught him patience, and the conscious choice they had both made to rebuild something that could not be rushed or forced. He glanced at Bella, noting the subtle shifts in her posture, the relaxed curve of her shoulders, the faint smile that appeared when their son gurgled, the warmth in her eyes that acknowledged the silent history between them without letting it dominate the present. The past had not vanished. It lingered like a shadow at the edge of the room, a reminder of mistakes made and lessons learned. Yet it no longer controlled them. Each moment of trust, each shared laugh, each quiet acknowledgement of presence reinforced the fragile, unspoken contract that now defined their family. Honesty, patience, and deliberate choice over convenience or pride. Peter spoke softly to his son, his voice steady, measured and free from the performative authority he had once wielded. The words were simple, intimate, and resonant with genuine emotion. He didn't declare ownership, he didn't promise perfection, he didn't attempt to rewrite history. He simply existed, fully present, every heartbeat synchronized with the fragile rhythm of a life he had once taken for granted. Bella listened, absorbing the authenticity of the moment, noting that this man, the man she had once doubted, feared, and mistrusted, was now fully, quietly, and irrevocably transformed. Would this presence endure beyond the holidays? Could consistency survive the pressures of life, ambition, and the world's unpredictable demands? The room filled with laughter as the boy, now more alert, reached for Peter's face, exploring with tiny, delicate fingers. Peter's hands cupped him gently, supporting yet allowing the child freedom to explore. Bella approached and placed a hand over his, and for the first time in years, their fingers intertwined without tension, without caution, without negotiation. It was not recovery, not a concession. It was choice, deliberate, conscious, and earned. Peter felt the weight of her trust in that simple act, heavier and more valuable than any contract, deal, or declaration he had ever known. Even the small imperfections, the slightly crooked tree, the unevenly wrapped gifts, the faint creaks in the floorboards, added to the authenticity of the moment. This was not grandeur, this was reality. It was warmth, it was patience, it was endurance translated into everyday acts. Peter understood that love, when earned honestly, did not repeat itself. It rebuilt quietly, deliberately, stronger than before. The stakes were no longer ego, wealth, or reputation. They were trust, presence, and commitment. Each micro-interaction carried meaning far beyond its surface. The narrative of performance, of control, of illusion had finally dissolved into something indestructible, quiet, deliberate, unshakable family bonds. The night deepened, snow covering the city streets in a pristine white blanket, while inside, laughter and soft murmurs created a cocoon of intimacy. Peter held the boy close, Bella resting her head near his shoulder, both aware of the history, the pain, the struggle, and the deliberate evolution that had brought them here. They did not need words to validate the journey. The history, the trials, the endurance were all reflected in their actions, their presence, their choice to remain in each other's lives authentically. Here, in this imperfect warmth, the family had been reclaimed not by entitlement, apology, or performance, but by deliberate, consistent, earned love. As the evening waned, Peter finally allowed himself to exhale, a long, slow release of the tension he had carried for years. The boy dozed peacefully in his arms, Bella's hand held his, and the room, though simple, imperfect and quiet, radiated more warmth than any mansion ever could. No declarations, no public performances, no announcements were needed. The past remained, but it no longer dictated terms. Love had been earned, presence had been proven, and trust had been rebuilt. The family he almost lost now existed fully, deliberately and irrevocably, stronger, quieter and unbreakable. And that was today's story on Beyond Color Stories, a tale of love lost, lessons learned, and trust rebuilt. Remember, true love isn't about grand gestures or fleeting passion. It's earned, it's patient, and it's unbreakable when proven through actions. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss the next journey that will move your soul. Comment below where you felt the strongest emotion, and let's keep the conversation alive. Until next time, stay patient, stay loving, and keep believing in the power of heartfelt stories.